Life expectancy is on the decline for the third year in a row, according to a new study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. This drop is despite the U.S. spending more on health care per capita than any other country in the world. One of the reasons cited for the fall is rise of drug overdoses. 2 in 3 adults first used opioids when they were younger than age 25. Presidential candidate Andrew Yang believes we should look to the Portugal model to solve this opioid crisis. His plan would decriminalize the possession and use of small amounts of opioids. I spoke with Andrew recently about his drug policy and how it would affect America. All right, Andrew, it's so great speaking with you. We had spoken before about your approach to the drug war and what you would do if you were president. Could you just lay that out for folks?
Well, first, I would legalize marijuana at a federal level. We have thousands of Americans who are in jail for nonviolent pot-related offenses for behaviors that are legal in several states at this point. So I would legalize marijuana and then pardon everyone who's in a federal prison for a nonviolent pot-related crime. But then I would go further and decriminalize opiates for personal use. And I know that's a very big step, but if you look at the genesis of the opiate crisis around the country, and I'm heading to New Hampshire right now, which is one of the states that's been hit the hardest, 8 Americans are dying of drug overdoses every hour, and the federal government was negligent in allowing this opiate crisis to spread. Purdue Pharma made tens of billions of dollars from OxyContin, which was marketed as a non-addictive wonder drug, but of course it was incredibly addictive. And so now you have thousands of Americans whose lives are being destroyed by an epidemic that the government essentially turned a blind eye towards. So at this point, we have to say this was a systemic failure of capitalism run amok in the worst and most destructive way possible, and that our government should come clean, claw back the resources from the drug companies and put them to work in communities to try and make people stronger and healthier, but also say to individuals who are struggling with addiction that this is not a crime of personal character, this is a systemic problem, and that if you're using drugs and addicted, we should be referring you to counseling and treatment and not a prison cell.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about that. Like, if someone is caught using heroin, what happens to them?
Well, their heroin gets taken away from them. And then if they're dealing heroin, if they're selling the large supply, then they go to jail. They have criminal penalties. But if they are just using, then they get referred to treatment, counseling centers, and are given a chance to kick the habit, to try and get well. I would not only decriminalize opiates for personal use, but I would also invest in safe consumption sites around the country. I was talking to a paramedic in New Hampshire who talked about how if he saved an addict 1 week, he would be back saving that same addict the following week, because after you're caught with the drugs, there's no place for you to go. So you go home and you're still addicted, and you wind up, in many cases, overdosing again. So we need to refer these people to counseling, treatment, and safe consumption sites as needed.
And as you said, in the American context, it sounds like a radical idea to say, you know, you're not going to be sent to prison for using heroin. In fact, we'll have safe consumption sites set up. How is it being received in places like New Hampshire that have been hit so hard by this crisis?
People are open to it because they've seen friends and family members and neighbors struggle with addiction. Where if you see it up close, you realize that this is not something that someone can just recover from through making different choices. One person put it best. They said, you can't come back from an addiction if you're dead. And unfortunately, that's the reality for many people who've seen this up close. So it's the folks that are affected by it most directly who are the most open to different approaches.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Well, and it also makes sense to me that this would be a focus of your campaign because you talk so much and focus so much on places that have been deindustrialized. And those are the exact same places that have struggled the most with this opioid crisis. But just talk a little bit about specifically what kind of inspired you here. Was there a particular person that you met or something that you personally experienced? What sent you down this road?
I was campaigning in Iowa, and a high school senior told me that his classmates had fentanyl patches on their arms and were already addicted, and he asked what we could do to help them. And I realized I didn't have a great answer for him, in part because his friends would never seek treatment or help because fentanyl's illegal. And so I started researching what other countries did when they were struggling with similar substance abuse epidemics. And I found that other countries, including Portugal, had decriminalized opiates for personal use, as I'm championing here in the U.S., and they saw a massive decrease in both overdose rates and substance abuse rates over time. And so I thought, well, if other developed countries had seen this would work, that it made people stronger and healthier and reduced overdose rates in particular, then I thought we should do the same thing here in the U.S. But I credit that high school senior in Iowa for pointing out to me what the reality was on the ground.
Yeah. Well, and it has such far-reaching consequences, not only in so many of our communities, but our drug war policies also fuel violence and destabilize entire regions around the world. Yet there's been very little focus on any of this at any of the debates or in any of the sort of elite media discussion of this primary. Why do you think that that is?
I have no idea why we're not talking about this more. I mean, again, it's the opiate plague is so bad that 8 Americans are dying of drugs every hour, and that in Ohio and other parts of the country, their morgues and public facilities have been so overwhelmed that they've been forced to send bodies to nearby funeral homes because they just can't store the victims. I mean, we're talking about a plague that is reducing our life expectancy actively for the last 3 years. The first time in 100 years that America's life expectancy has declined, and it's because drug overdoses have overtaken vehicle deaths as a cause of death in this country. So to me, this is front and center. I mean, it's tearing apart families, communities. When I'm campaigning and I'm talking to a town hall, there are always people who've had friends, family members, or neighbors die from overdoses. So to me, this is one of the most important problems of this time. And again, it's a disease of capitalism run amok, because it would not have happened if we hadn't had Purdue spreading hundreds of thousands of OxyContin prescriptions around the country over the last number of years.
Yeah, so well said. And yet, have you received even one question about it on a debate stage?
I would love to have a question about it on the debate stage. I did get a question about it, and I talked about my plan, and I got a lot of positive feedback on that, because people who are struggling with addiction know that we need to do more.
Andrew, thank you so much. It's so great to have your time. I really appreciate your perspective on this.
Thank you, Crystal. You're one of the best. I'll see you soon.
Okay, see you soon. And we'll have more Rising after this.